Alright guys, welcome back to Wild Outdoor Living. It has been a really long time since I made a video, and so I'm bringing you guys the long-term review of the Trek Stache that I promised you guys almost a year ago when I gave you the first impressions video of my Trek Stache 7, basically back when I first got it. So the Trek Stache, just so we're all on the same page, is a 29 plus trail hardtail. So it's got 120 millimeters of travel. It has 29-inch wheels and 3-inch tires. It has a really short rear end, a really advanced aluminum frame. There's also a carbon version, and it only comes with a 1x drivetrain. So the Stache 7 that I have has a 1x11. The new carbon version has a 1x12, and the Stache 5 has a 1x10. I got really interested in the Stache based on the type of primitive backcountry rides that I like to do the most, that are really rough, but I still love the feel of a hardtail and wanted something that was simple and reliable, but more comfortable than what I had had before and was able to tackle more difficult terrain. So I got really interested in Plus. I knew that Trek made wonderfully handling and wonderfully fit frames based on my Trek Superfly and some of the other Trek bikes that I had ridden. So I got really interested in the Stache, decided to buy one last year, and I was not disappointed. I used it for enduro races. I took it on a road ride once for some reason. I took it on, of course, my backcountry rides, solo and with a group this year, which was actually pretty cool, and helped to teach the mountain bike class. So I was the TA for the mountain bike class here on campus. And those are all places where you need to go downhill in really rugged terrain and go uphill and cover a lot of distance. And you just need a really good all-around bike. I didn't want a bike that held me back at all, and the Stache definitely didn't. It did all the things I expected. It went downhill really well because it has a short rear end and a beefy fork and good trail geometry. It went uphill really well because it has a ton of grip, and it's also a fairly agile bike, which based on 29 plus wheels might be surprising, but it's actually one of the best handling bikes I've ever had. What surprised me the most, I would say, was that it's actually really fast. Like, I've had a lot of XC bikes, none of them like super high end. My Trek Superfly is quite a high end race bike. Once I got it all updated, weighed about 25 pounds, so right there in the mid range. But the Stache is somehow faster in most places. Even on the road, they're about almost the same. And then on a trail, the Stache is faster. I think mostly due to the fact that there's just less stuff that can slow the bike down. Even having the fork locked out, the Stache rides a little bit smoother than my Superfly did with the fork fully open. So it takes on brutal trails a lot better. And it's just about as fast downhill as my Cannondale Jekyll, which was a 160 travel bike that handled really beefy, gnarly downhills really well, but it didn't pedal very well. So if it wasn't really steep, the Stache is much better. But the biggest thing I loved about it was the fit. I mean, it fits. I could not find a bike that felt more balanced, for me at least, in the Stache. And so it was just super comfortable to sit on, to go downhill, to go uphill. I mean, like, rad. It's super fun. Things I didn't like, I love the fit, but the reach on the 2017 was an eensy bit short. And the head tube angle could have been slacker, but it also climbed like a scalded monkey. And so I couldn't really complain. Like, I was completely satisfied with the way it fit. But those were things that you could possibly change. Otherwise, like, honestly, the stock saddle is not great. But to be honest, like, the bike was stellar right out of the box. That really had no complaints. The Manitou fork was really good, but the quick release, or the through axle, I should say, a little bit wonky, easy to get out, really hard to get back in, just really tricky, and not very intuitive to use. And then there was basically no instructions on how to set that fork up. It was a little bit confusing because it had way more stanchion than a normal fork would, since that bridge is on the back side. So it never looked like it was getting full travel, even though it was. Once I played with it for a while, I actually really liked it. But there were some wonky things about it. You really couldn't get a Mucky Nuts fender for it, at least not easily. So, and the bars I felt were just a touch narrower for me personally, but that's totally a personal preference thing. The tires, the Chupacabra tires, some people love them, some people hate them. I felt like they're really fast, and because they're 3 inches wide, they have a ton of grip. But of course, in the really loose stuff, they're not going to be as grippy as a Maxxis Minion. But for most riders, I think that Chupacabra is going to be a great place to start. And if you need a really, really tough tire for a certain reason, you can go with that. But I think most people who buy the Stache are going to really benefit from the Chupacabras all around. So it might be surprising that I ended up selling that bike basically a little while ago. Basically because someone came to me and really wanted to buy it, and it was really good timing for me at the time, honestly, just to sell that bike. So I was a little apprehensive because I loved the way the bike looked, and I just loved it overall. But I sold it, and then I started looking to what I was going to do in the future. I was pretty confident I would buy a Stache. I considered the Stache 7 and also the Stache 9.7, which is a carbon bike. Ultimately, the carbon Stache was just too expensive for me, and I didn't feel it added that much value for what I do. And then I also looked at bikes like the Surly Krampus, which I think is a better bike packing bike, but ultimately would have been more expensive for my uses, just because I would have had to have bought a suspension fork and a dropper seat post. And since it's a 30.9 diameter seat post, my options are less limited, or more limited, I should say, than what is on the Stache. I also considered the Salsa Woodsmoke SLX 29 Plus. Really like the 29 Plus, guys. So they make some other versions, but that was the only one I really considered. That bike is almost identical to the Stache 7, with the exception that it's $1,200 more. So the main reason for that is carbon. There's definitely benefits to carbon, but the Stache has a really high-end premium aluminum frame, and those bikes they weigh like almost exactly the same. And so, yeah, I think I'd be willing to pay a little bit more for the Woodsmoke, being that it's carbon, but not that much more. So ultimately, I ruled it out, but I'd love to test one long term if Salsa wants to send one over. So just saying. I also considered getting a Salsa Muckluck fat bike and getting 29 plus wheels for it, and then a suspension fork for the summer. That was really tempting, other than the fact that I already have a fat bike, and that definitely would have been a more expensive option. So the only benefit to having two fat bikes is that me and my wife would be able to ride in the snow together. But with 3 kids in the house, the chances of that happening very often are pretty slim. And so ultimately, I just decided I would go ahead and get the Stache 7 for 2018. I will say right out of the box that I made a few upgrades to it. So part of the reason I prefer it is because of those upgrades. I put a Ergon SM E3 Pro saddle on it. So a lighter saddle that was actually wide enough for me. This saddle's way more comfortable. And then I put on a set of 760 millimeters, so just a touch wider than stock, race face turbine bars. And I made sure to get all these parts in blue, including the race face Chester pedals as usual, just to offset the fully black stealthed out paint job, which I'm not really a fan of. Black is fine, but it's just fully black is just not for me. Adding blue to it made this bike look super sick. Like, I like this bike in terms of aesthetics better than I liked the old Stache, which is really surprising because I was really stoked on that bike. I ordered this bike just a little bit after the total eclipse that happened, and so my son was actually born within the hour of that total eclipse, so it was a really, really interesting day for us, and the thought kind of came to my mind that this blue and black thing would look really cool, and it really did, kind of as an ode to that experience. So that said, Other than those upgrades, the differences between the 2017 and 2018, the 2018 I think has a better fork. I wasn't sure if it did going into it, but now that I've ridden it, I really do feel like the Yari is a better fork. It's 35 millimeter rather than a 34, so it's a touch wider in diameter, which makes it feel a little bit more responsive, but at the same time, it's a much plusher fork, and it's easier to tune, it's easier to upgrade, way easier to service, or at least get parts for, and you can actually get a mucky nuts fender for it, so we can keep it clean. And so I actually far prefer it. I will say there's nothing wrong with the Manitou, and I would have no problem riding that fork for a long time, but I do feel like the Yari is a better fork now that I've ridden it. The drivetrain and such is a bit of a toss-up. The GX stuff from SRAM was really good, really crisp. That cassette is actually really light. The SLX drivetrain is smooth, maybe not quite as crisp, and it has a much lower gear. So not only is the low gear lower, but it also doesn't have quite as much high gear. It still has enough for me to be on the road and be out on dirt roads and what have you. I can pedal up as fast as I want. If you pedal really slow, you might want to switch chain rings. But that 11 to 46 cassette and 28 tooth chain ring on single track is fantastic, especially if you're looking to do some burly climbs. The brakes are MT500s. Now on the 2017, it had SRAM level TLs. I felt like the modulation was great. Loved the feel of those brakes. But I had to warranty both lever assemblies because the plunger in those brakes would swell in hot weather and kind of lock up the brake, or at least partially lock it up. Really bad feeling, and yeah, it definitely wasn't going to work through the summer. So they warranted those. They did it really well. SRAM was really supportive. And after that, had zero issues. So I was really happy with them for the rest of the time. But that being said, they are definitely harder to bleed. I luckily only had to bleed them once when I put the new levers on. And otherwise, they were perfect. Fade free. I mean, no problems there. Some people like them, some people won't. But the MT500s from Shimano that come on the new Stache, I wasn't sure much about them, but they actually look a lot like Shimano XT brakes in terms of their build quality and their finish and everything. The only thing that is basic is the rotors. They decide to just use a basic rotor. But otherwise, they feel like a premium brake, and they're going to be much easier to work on and much easier to live with. So, I mean, if I was doing a stock build, I would probably pick those brakes over the SRAMs. So I feel like that, for someone who's going to work on their own bike, is an upgrade. In terms of feel, that the SRAMs might have been slightly better. But overall, the bike feels a little bit more premium. I will say that the 2017 didn't come with a dropper post. The 2018 does. I put a 150 millimeter drop line on my 2017, and I got the same post for this bike. So I actually never used the stock dropper. It's similar to the drop line. The lever's a bit different, and it's non-serviceable. So for anyone that gets that one, I mean, it's a great value. You'll be able to have a dropper post for as long as it works, and then after a few years, if it does have any issues, if it happens to be out of warranty, you'll just be buying a different dropper post. But overall, I think the design is really good. And honestly, that's something I probably need to review in another video. But overall, the changes to the frame are definitely the most notable. Those are things that I worried about because I felt like the 2017 was really sorted. The head angle is a tiny bit slacker. The reach is a little bit longer, and the bottom bracket sits a little bit lower. So these are all things that should be an upgrade. For my type of riding, I loved having so much pedal clearance, and I loved climbing really well. The 2018 actually doesn't lose any of that, though. They made some changes that I feel like improve the bike, but it doesn't hurt it. And so it corners a little bit better. It goes downhill with a little bit more poise, but it still climbs really great. And it's able to run a shorter stem, so you sit in about the same spot on the bike, but you've got more room to move around because the frame is basically just a bit longer. And so I feel like if you're able to sell your Stache and buy a new one for basically the same price, it is an upgrade. If you have to spend a bunch of money to get rid of your old Stache to go to a new one, I don't feel like it's worth it. you already have a stellar bike and you'll barely be able to notice the changes. If you don't have a Stache yet and you love hardtails and you love the type of riding that I've kind of described, I feel like the bike is a really good buy for a lot of people. I think it's a good bike packing bike, even though it lacks some bottle cage mounts that I prefer. It's only got 2 of them. I feel like it's a great single track bike. I feel like the Stache is a bike you can push really hard. You can go after PRs on if you want to. And then you can ride some really weird places and some really primitive places that people don't get to very often on a bike and require more traction, more float, and all of these things. So if you're that type of rider, I think you're going to love the Stache. If you're someone who loves full suspension, the Stache is not a full suspension bike. It's still a hardtail. You still have to ride it like a hardtail, but it takes trails that are absolutely aggravating on a normal 29er hardtail, and they become like just bumpy on a Stache. I mean, it's way, way smoother. So, yeah, I mean, if that fits you, like, go for it. It's a stellar bike. There's not much I can complain about it, honestly. All right, guys. Until next time, we'll catch you later.